Says the Pasuk, this week's Parsha, Bazois HaBrocha. V'yom Alem, Moshe says, Ben 120 shana anochi hayom. I'm 120 years old. Shein Talmud lo hayom. The Gemara in Sota says, why do we need to know hayom? What is hayom going to add to our understanding that he says, today I'm 120 years old? Answers the Gemara, hayom malu yamai v'shnoisai. That I'm 120 years old exactly, according to my days, according to my years. Lilamedcha shakorish baruch hu mashlim shnoiseim shel tzadikim miyoim liyoim umichodesh lechodesh. Gemara teaches that it's coming to tell us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu completes the years of a tzaddik according to the days, according to the months. Dichsiv es mispar yameche amaleh, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will fill up the days of the tzaddikim. Continues the pasuk and says, Moshe Rabbeinu explains, Lo yuchal oid letzeis v'lavoy. It's not possible for me to letzeit v'lavo, to go out, to come in. So Gemara, ma letzeit v'lavoy. What does that mean, to go out, to come in? Leima letzeis v'lavoy mamish. V'achsiv. Umoshe ben 120 shana b'moisoi lo nas lechoi. It can't be saying that Moshe Rabbeinu is not capable of going and coming, of being able to walk around, be able to go places, because the pasuk also teaches that he was 120 years old. Lo nes lechoi. He never lost his strength. More than that, says the Gemara, Uchsiv, Ve'al Moshe ma'avas moya vel har navoi. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought Moshe Rabbeinu to Har Navoi in order for him to die over there. Explains the Gemara, V'tanya, Shtemesei malois ayusham, there were 12 steps going up to where Moshe needed to be. Upasan Moshe b'psia achas. Moshe Rabbeinu, on the last day of his life, the last moments of his life, jumped up all 12 steps all in one go. So what can it mean? What can it mean that Moshe Rabbeinu is not capable of being able to go out, to come back? Says the Gemara, Rabbi Shmuel ben Achmani, Rabbi Yonason, letzeis ve'lavoy b'divrei Torah. That he wasn't able to give and take in Divrei Torah, to teach Torah. Melamed shenistamu mimenu sharei chochma. HaKadosh Baruch Hu closed off the gates of knowledge, the gates of wisdom. Therefore, he wasn't able to give over Torah to Klal Yisrael. Imre Emes, one of the Rabbis from Gur, explains not that Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't able to understand Torah anymore, that's not pshat, but rather Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't capable of giving over Torah to Klal Yisrael. It's an incredible thing. At the end of his life, Moshe Rabbeinu no longer has the ability to be able to transfer Torah from himself to the Jewish people. And that's how Moshe Rabbeinu knows that his life is coming to an end. So maybe the first lesson over here is that wisdom can't be taken for granted. I once saw a quote, I don't know from who, that age doesn't always bring wisdom. Sometimes people age by themselves without becoming any wiser. Moshe Rabbeinu's wisdom was never taken away from him. His wisdom continues to grow But what is taken away from him is his ability to be able to give back to the Jewish nation. Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen Lublin points out that one of the differences between the human world and the animal world is that an animal left to its own devices very rarely becomes fat. Animals eat what they need to eat, and then, when they've had enough, they stop eating. Humans, on the other hand, have the capacity, and I'm speaking from personal experience, to continue eating even when they don't need to eat anymore. The words of Rabbi Yisachar Frand, human beings, on the other hand, have the capacity to be almost comatose on the couch after eating a big meal, unable to move from gorging, and yet when the chocolate cream pie is brought out, we hear, emanating from the depths of the couch, a voice saying, well, maybe I'll just have one little piece. Where does that desire for just a little bit more, where does it come from? Human beings are driven. We're driven for just one more, whether it's one more piece of cake, whether it's one more qualification, whether it's one more experience. Animals don't have that. You don't see animals looking at the animal next to it to see whether their food is tastier or better or more attractive than the food that they've been given. And yet human beings, that's what we do. We compare the whole time. We look and we see and we wonder why it is that the person over there has got something that I don't have, or why the person over there, what he has, looks better than the same thing that I have. Rabbi Tzadok Milublin is teaching us the most incredibly fundamental idea over here. The very basis of a human being is to want more, because at the very core of each human being is an neshama, is the soul. A soul is something which is eternal. The soul is something which can never be satiated, because the soul is always looking for more. The soul is always wanting a closer relationship with Hashem. The soul is always desirous to be able to connect in a stronger, in a firmer way. David HaMelech, in Tehillim, in Psalms, in Samach Gimel writes, Tzoma lecha nafshi, kama lecha basari. My soul longs for you. My flesh yearns for you. Will always strive for more, will always want more. Because nothing in this world can ever satisfy on the deepest internal level what it is that we're looking for. The very famous medrash in Shir HaShirim Rabbah, which says, Mi sheyesh lo mono, rotzeh matayim. A person who has 100 wants 200. Mi sheyesh lo matayim, somebody has 200, rotzeh abamot, he wants 400. What's pshat? First of all, says Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, the late Rosh Hashiva in the Mir, very simple pshat. If you notice that the dream, whatever he wants, is getting further away. If you've got 100, you just need 100 to get to 200. But if you've got 200, now you want 400. That requires 200 more in order to get to where you want to get to. And 400 becomes 800, and 800 becomes 1600. the more you have, the further away it's getting. What's the Medrash teaching though? What's Pshat? Medrash is teaching us the most incredible idea over here. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created us with desires, and it doesn't matter how much we have, we'll always want more. Because there's nothing wrong with desires. There's nothing wrong with taivas. The question is, where do we put our desires? Where are we channeling those desires? Because the same need to have more can be used for money and it can be used for mitzvahs as well. A person has one mitzvah, they want 2 mitzvahs. A person has 2 mitzvahs, they want 4 mitzvahs. So let's try to understand. Says the Pasuk, the beginning of Parshas Vayelech. Vayelech Moshe. And Moshe went. He went to the Jewish people. He walked out to the Jewish people. Listen to this. Says the Medrash Tanchumah. Ein lecha loshen vayelech ele toichacha. The word vayelech implies some kind of a rebuke. Vayelech Moshe, Moshe goes out to rebuke the Jewish people. But if you read the psukim over there, if you read the verses, there's no rebuke. I once heard Pshat. It's incredible. Vayelech Moshe, he's 120 years old. This is the last day of his life. And the only thing that concerns him is to do another mitzvah. To do another mitzvah and another mitzvah. That's the ultimate rebuke to all the people that are left here in this physical world, is to see somebody consumed with a desire to perform another mitzvah, noch a mitzvah, noch a mitzvah. So listen to this. Rav Eliyahu Kitov says that in this world, a person doesn't own his greatest asset. Which is what? What's he saying? That what a person lacks, what a person doesn't have, is their greatest asset, because that's their greatest possible potential. The potential for aspiration, for yearning, to turn what he doesn't own into his own. We all know. People who invent things, people who design things, people who create for us objects to make our lives simpler, to make our lives smoother, are people who are driven with a desire to do something which hasn't existed up until now. But wanting to produce, wanting to create, has to be done carefully. Avram Pam used to explain what distinguishes a person from being expeditious to one who's being hasty. What separates somebody who's azoriz, somebody who does things speedily, to somebody who's bahul, somebody who does things unthinkingly? That azoriz thinks and prepares before he acts. Whereas another person will just rush into doing something without even thinking about it. Explains Rav Pam, zrizas, doing things speedily, means well thought out intentions, devotion to Hashem, connecting through our hearts, through our minds, and through our souls. It's the most beautiful story told about Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel. Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel was the late Rosh Yeshiva in the Mir, suffered from Parkinson's for decades, and towards the end of his life, he could hardly function physically, and yet he continued learning, and he continued running the Mir. The Mir is the largest yeshiva in the world. Continued raising funds, traveling all over the world, even though anyone else in his position wouldn't have been able to do anything. Physically debilitated. And the famed founder of Starbucks, Howard Schultz, came to Rav Nosson Tzvi for a visit. And at the end of the visit, he took out his checkbook, signed a check, and he gave it to Rav Nosson Tzvi. And he said to him, "Here, you should fill it out for whatever sum you want to be there." The monthly budget in the Mir at the time was $2 million. I would imagine that Rav Nosson Tzvi could have filled in $2 million, and Howard Schultz presumably wouldn't have batted an eyelid. Rav Nosson Tzvi looked at Howard Schultz and he says to him, "I can put in any sum, anything, it's okay." And he said to him, "Yeah." And Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel took the check and he filled it out for $1,200. And then he gave it back to Howard Schultz and he told him, "Here, take this check, go to the store across the road, tell them that I sent you to buy a pair of tefillin, and then put them on every day. That's what you can do for me." Yipshat. Instead of looking at Howard Schultz and saying, "How much can I squeeze out of him? What can I get out of him?" Rav Nosson Tzvi looked at Howard Schultz and said, "What can I do for him?" Because inside of every single Jew is a desire to be connected to Hashem. And all that needs to be done is to awaken that desire inside of the person. But it's not just Torah knowledge that's a defining factor. Rabbi Salanta, the founder of the Musa movement that places its emphasis on us becoming better, more moral, more ethical Jews, used to say that a person can possess the most incredible knowledge in Talmud, to be a font of penetrating analysis, and yet not be considered to be a Talmid Chacham. Because if he doesn't allow the Torah to refine his midas and restructure his personality, then he's nothing more than an Am Ha'oretz, an ignoramus who happens to know how to learn. What an astonishing statement. A person can be a font of Torah knowledge, and in the words of Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, be an ignoramus who happens to know how to learn. what's called an Am Haaretz. The Shlach explains that an Am Haaretz, what kind of phrase is Am Haaretz? A nation of the land. Explains the Shlach Kodesh, and Am Haaretz is somebody who looks at the Eretz, he looks at the land as being his home. He belongs to the Am of the world, to the physicality. When a person learns Torah, and the more knowledge that they accumulate, the greater is their understanding that we're only here temporarily. We're only passing through. And if a person truly understands that they're only passing through, then the chances of there becoming an Am Haaretz are vastly reduced. Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, when he became the Rav, one of the positions that he had throughout his life. So the minig is that, as a rule, on Simchas Torah, Chosan Torah is given to the Rav, and Chosan Bereishis is given out. It's sold for the good of the shul. In the shul where he was a Rav, for some reason, the first year that he was there, a very wealthy person decided that he wanted to be Chosan Torah, and he started bidding for it, and he bought it, and he didn't give it to Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. He kept it for himself. Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz commented about that wealthy man that he was a real tzaddik. He said, imagine, he's a chosen, and he hasn't seen his Kala for an entire year. The man bought chosen Torah, but the man was an ignoramus. He didn't have any connection to the Torah. So what kind of chatan, what kind of chosen is he? But if the Am Haaretz is somebody who belongs to the physical world, somebody who lives here in the physical and doesn't recognize that something greater, something bigger that's waiting. So says Rav Chaim Shmulevitz, so too with a Ben Olam Haba. Here in this physical world, it's possible for a person to become a Ben Olam Haba, somebody who belongs to Olam Haba, to the world to come. Someone who recognizes that their true place is not here in this physical world. Rather, their true place is in the world to come, is a Ben Olam Haba. There's a very famous story they tell about the Chofetz Chaim, that a businessman came through, traveled to Radin in order to get a bracha from the Chofetz Chaim that he should have hatzloch in his business deals. And he got the Chofetz Chaim home, which was nothing more than a glorified shed. And he was so taken aback by the Spartan conditions. He looked at the Chofetz Chaim and he said to him, Rabbi, where are your things? Where are your possessions? And the Chofetz Chaim looked at him and he said, where are yours? And the businessman said to the Chofetz Chaim, mine, I'm just passing through. Mine are not here. And the Chofetz Chaim smiled at him and he said, I'm also just passing through. A person can live here in this physical world and be a Ben Olam Haba. A person can live here in this physical world, but his real domain, his real home, is the world to come. One of the lessons that we learn from Moshe Rabbeinu, from his continual striving, is that we have an obligation to try to understand ourselves, and perhaps more importantly, to try and understand the others around as well. Listen to this incredible definition from Rav Yitzchak Hutner, that with his great mind he was able to understand the heart of another. Whereas Rav Shlomo Feld, his great heart, was able to understand the mind of another. We need to learn how to synthesize the heart and the mind in order to be able to understand that both ourselves and those around us. In the Hasidic Dvarim, they explain that the word Adam, a person, the first person is Adam Arishon. The word Adam is an acronym that alludes to humility. In order to be a successful Eved Hashem, in order to be somebody who serves God successfully, properly, healthily, one of the most basic dimensions is anova, to be humble. Adam, Aleph, Daled, Mem. Aleph is the Aleph of Avraham. Avraham, who turns to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and says, Va'anoichi offer ve'efer, I'm nothing but dust in your eyes. The Daled of Adam is David HaMelech, who writes in Tehillim, Va'anoichi toilas ve'loi ish. I'm nothing, a worthless worm, nothing. And the name of Adam is Moshe. Moshe, who says about himself, Anachnu ma, who are we? We're nothing. To be humble, to be modest, to recognize that the successes that we have and the achievements that we reach are not ours alone, but rather HaKadosh Baruch Hu allows us to reach where it is that we've got to. In the introduction to the Sefer Rekanati, Rav Menachem Rekanati wrote the most incredible Sefer, full of chidushim. And in his introduction, he explains how he became a Talmid Chacham. Listen to this story; it's something extraordinary. He writes about himself that he loved to learn Torah, but he was born with a very weak mind. Gas hasechel ma'oi. Couldn't learn properly. He davened to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and he fasted a lot, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should open his heart, open his mind, to let him understand Torah. And once, on one of his fast days, he was davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he should be able to learn Torah, to understand his Torah, and he fell asleep in the base of Medrash. Little bit like you people over here. And he had a dream. And in his dream, he saw somebody wanting to give him a bottle of water. And he woke up in his dream and he drank from the water. And before Rav Menachem Rekanati finished drinking the water, the man disappeared. And Rav Rekanati returned to learning, to his studies, and all of a sudden he saw that his mind was sharp. He'd become a new person. And that's when he wrote his Chidushim on the Torah. That story would be extraordinary enough as it were. But the Rekanati was 80 years old when this story took place. It was 2 years before he died. All the tefillahs of his lifetime finally paid off. And the last 2 years of his life, he wrote the most incredible svarim, studied by Talmidei Chachamim up to and including today. The Stipler Gaon, the father of Rav Chaim Kanievsky Shlita, he cites the story of the Rekanati, and then he writes, the truth is, even if one has a weak mind, if he will place all of his strength into studying Torah, he'll receive Siyata Dishmaya and become a Gadol b'Torah. He'll become great in Torah understanding, even if it's far beyond his natural abilities. And then the Stipler goes on to say something incredible. He says many people stop learning Torah because they have a weak mind. And he said, actually, it's the opposite. They have a weak mind because they stopped learning Torah. If they would only have persevered, they would have succeeded in learning Torah, just like the Rekanati when he was 80 years old. Gemara in Nedorim, Daf Mem Aleph, Amud Aleph, says, Ein oni ela bedas. The greatest poverty that a person can have is a lack of wisdom. So explain the Bnei Yisoscha. Listen to this incredible idea. If the greatest poverty a person can have is the lack of wisdom, then the greatest form of tzedakah that a person can give is sharing their wisdom. The idea can be found in the Avei Nachal as well. Says the Avei Nachal, there are two forms of tzedakah. The first is to simply give money to a poor person. The second is to give wisdom to the ignorant. To guide a person, to teach them, to do tshuva is the greatest level of tzedakah there is. Or in the words of Rav Shamshon Hirsch, in his eloquent style, it's not how much or how little you have that makes you great or small, but how much or how little you do with what you have. One of the great rabbis from the previous generations, Shagas Aryeh, celebrated a Siyum on Shas. He finished the entirety of the Talmud, and he made a big meal for all of his students, for his family. The Shagas Aryeh was known to be one of the most brilliant people in his generation. He was already an elderly man at the time, and his Talmidim, his students, were unsure. Why was he making a siyum now? It can't be the first time that he's finished the whole of the Talmud. You know what he told them? He's making a siyum on Shas and making a Suda for all of his Talmidim now because it was the 1,000th time that he'd completed the entire Talmud together with Tosfos. Just got to keep going. Another line, and another line, and another chapter, and another tractate. But in order to be able to do that, we have to understand what's important and what's not. I once read a very cute story. A teacher, beginning a class one day, she comes in and she puts an empty jar on her desk. And she fills it to the top with large rocks. And she asks the class, 8, 9-year-old kids, Is this jar full? So yes, they all shout together, yes, yes, it's full. Really? She said. And then she took a bag of gravel and started pouring it into the jar, filling up the spaces between the rocks. Is it full now? She asked the kids. Yes, yes, they all shouted together. And she took a bag of sand and she started pouring the sand in. And the sand filled the space between the gravel. So she asked them again, is it full now? And they all shouted, yes, it's full, it's full. So she asked the kids, what's the lesson over here? The kids thought a little bit more. One child says that no matter how full your life is, there's always room for some more. She said, that's nice, that's cute, she says, but that's not the real lesson over here. And then what did she do? She took the contents of the jar, she turned it upside down, and she told the kids that this time they should fill up the jar, they should start with the sand, and then put in the gravel, and then the rocks. So they put in the sand, they put in the gravel, they start putting in the rocks, there's no room. They tried and they took it out, they started again, put the sand back in, and then the gravel back in, and the rocks back in, and there's still lots of rocks sitting around on the top of the desk over there. There's no room to put them in. So finally she says, children, the message, the lesson over here is that if you don't put the big rocks in first, you'll never get them in. What's going on? Big rocks represent the truly important things in our lives. The big rocks represent Torah, mitzvahs, family. When we put what's important in first, then we can find time to put the smaller things in around it. And then we can add in trivial things as well. But if we start with the smaller things and the trivial things, we'll never have time for what's really important. I saw a quote from Serena Williams, one of the greatest tennis players in the world. She said, am I the greatest? I don't know. But I'm the greatest that I can be. And that's something that we will have to aspire towards. Will we be the greatest? I don't know. But when we get upstairs in the age of 120 and give an accounting for what we've done, we need to aspire to be able to say that I was the greatest that I can be. One of the great Hasidic Rabbis, Rabbi Zusha, used to say, when it comes to the great day of reckoning, when I stand in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I have to give an accounting, I'm not worried that Hashem is going to say to me, Zusha, why weren't you like Rabbi Akiva? Or Zusha, why weren't you like Rabbi Akiva Eger? But I am scared that he's going to say to me, Zusha, why weren't you Zusha? Each and every one of us is here for an individual reason. Each and every one of us is unique. Each and every one of us needs to do what it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to fulfill down here in this physical world. In his blessing to Asher, Moshe Rabbeinu tells, Bazel u'nochoishes minolecho u'choyamecho dovecho. May your borders be sealed like iron and copper, And like the days of your prime, so may your old age be. Rashi explains a somewhat enigmatic sentence. Rashi says, despite living on the border, they would be so safe. It would be as if the borders were locked with iron and copper. Sfasemes, Kedake HaKodesh, has his own take. And it says in the name of his grandfather, the Chidush Yarim, that Minolecho is not referring to physical borders. It's referring to us, to our human borders. That in order to be able to grow, we have to be able to control ourselves. But more than that, you can read the Pasuk so that the last words of the verse are the reasons, the first words of the verse. That the degree to which a person is successful in holding on to his koiches and his midas from his youth will allow him to retain those assets and help him to handle old age. A young person's possible lack of focus is very, very dangerous. I had a Talmud once who told me, you know what ADHD stands for? It stands for attention deficit. Hey, donuts. We lose focus of what it is that we're supposed to be looking at. When a person is young, he should look up, minolecho, to control the gifts that were given to him by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, lest they get lost in indulgence. Pasuk in Koheles that we just read on Shabbos says, "Uschores borecho, b'yemei bechorisecho, ad asher lo yavo yemei hara, v'higiu shonim asher toima eini bahem chayfetz." You should remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come, and those years arrive, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Says the Medrash, Koheles Rabbah. What's being referred to over here? Yemei hara, the evil days, the bad days, Elu yemei hazikna. Those are the days of zikna, of becoming old. Einli behem chefetz. I have no pleasure in them. Says the Medrash, Elu hayisurim. That's referring to the tribulations and the trials that we go through. So on the one hand, it sounds like old age is something which is not to be looked forward to. But on the other hand, the Sfasemis brings a Zoyar that old age is not necessarily a bad thing at all. But only when a person is a tzaddik. When a person is a tzaddik, then their old age is something for them to look forward to, something for them to cherish. So what's pshat? Is youth preferable to old age? Why would that be? Says the Sfasemes, Habachrus ika akoyach. Because when a person is young, they're at their strong. Physical strength. Says a Pasuk in Tehillim, Tzadik Beis, Oy Jenuvim B'Seima, D'Shenim V'Ananim Yiyu, that they'll be fruitful in old age, full of sap and freshness. but only if they are shesulim b'beis Hashem. Only if they are planted b'beis Hashem, in the house of Hashem. Chazal teach in Kinim, Perek Gimel, that an Am Ha'aretz, as a rule, the older they get, the more confused they get. Whereas a Talmid Chacham, his mind becomes clearer as he becomes older. I heard a story many years ago about someone who was looking for a source for what he thought was a saying of the sages from Chazal. Couldn't find it, so he decided he was going to ask the Gedolim, the great sages of the generation. And he traveled down to Bnei Brak, and he spoke with Rabbi Nissim Karelitz, and he spoke with Chaim Kanievsky, and he spoke with Rav Vosner, and then he came back and he spoke to Rabbi Yashiv, and each one of them answered as clearly as can be. The exception of Rav Chaim Kanievsky, at the time, every single one of those Gedolim was well into their 90s. That's what the Medrash is saying. The greater a tzaddik somebody is, the greater a Talmid Chacham they are, the clearer things become. If a person lives a life that includes Hashem the whole time in their youth, so then when he gets older, he won't have a hard time. Moshe Rabbeinu was 120 years old, and yet he has the vitality and the strength that he had when he was much younger. Why? Because he lived a life of shesulim b'veis Hashem. He was planted in the house of Hashem. It's important to understand one last thing. Our strengths and our talents and our personalities have been given to us by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And they've been given to us by HaKadosh Baruch Hu in order to enhance HaKadosh Baruch Hu's majesty here in this world. The very last words that Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was the Poisek Ador, leading halachic decider of the generation, the very last words he said when he was being taken to the hospital in an ambulance, he said in Yiddish, "Ich hab mehr nicht kein koyach." I have no more koyach. I have no more strength. That Rabbi Moshe Feinstein understood that all of his strength to him by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, not a physically strong person. He was small of stature. He suffered from various medical ailments. And yet, he carried the whole Klal Yisrael on his shoulders. One of my all-time favorite stories is of a father who came to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein with his young son to complain. Said his son's not physically growing. No, he's not very tall. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein himself was 5 foot tall. So we're not going to discuss the insensitivity of the father coming to someone of 5 foot tall to complain about the fact that his son is not growing. What did Rabbi Moshe Feinstein do? He pinched boy's cheek, and he told the father, "Don't you worry. I know some small people that became big." That we should be able to utilize the wondrous gifts that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given each and every one of us. And like Moshe Rabbeinu, we should be zoiche to reach beyond ourselves every single day and to touch the infinite. Amen. Amen.